Se non si sente io vi porto il microfono. Dite, anche però voi avete bisogno di 2 microfoni.
Il problema è per la registrazione eventualmente delle domande, quindi forse è meglio mettere...
Per la registrazione è meglio avere il microfono. Ok, allora passo col microfono.
Ora, bene, e naturalmente io ringrazio Clive per la sua relazione, per averci fatto partecipi non solo di alcune riflessioni che hanno mostrato come il suo pensare attorno alle domande che nate nell'opera L'Economista Mistico hanno continuato a crescere, ma anche per renderci partecipi dell'esperienza, della dimensione esperienziale, esistenziale che ha accompagnato queste riflessioni e che non credo sia difficile per noi comprendere, è stata determinante anche nel far cambiare i paradigmi di pensiero. L'esperienza concreta e il pensiero non vanno su 2 binari separati, ma si muovono in connessione. Ora, niente, io lascio il tempo, abbiamo un po' recuperato sul ritardo, non del tutto, ma un po' sì, perché abbiamo un po' di tempo per dialogare. Ci piacerebbe raccogliere le vostre domande più che altro.
Ecco qua, ce n'è già una persona giovane prenotata.
Grazie.
Faccio in italiano, tanto lui poi... Ok. Dalla riflessione che ha fatto Clive, la domanda che io volevo porgli era, alla luce di tutto quello che è successo, quindi di tutto quello che l'ha portato a un determinato pensiero, che cosa pensa ora del presente, di quello che sta succedendo, delle trasformazioni climatiche, dell'economia, di quello che l'uomo oggi può fare per migliorare il futuro o comunque per dare un qualche cosa affinché il futuro possa cambiare. Ma cosa Clive pensa oggi, dell'oggi? Grazie.
Ma anch'io ho una domanda che... possiamo... 2 le facciamo? Magari ho una terza poi. No, io volevo chiedere a Hamilton se questo terremoto che ti è successo all'interno non ti ha anche fatto pensare, ma come posso dire, sarò matto? Cioè, mentre io ho sentito una profonda consapevolezza di una, uso il termine alterità inteso in termini infiniti, no? Non so come dire, però mi chiedo anche, perché mi corrisponde quello che tu dici, però dentro di me a volte mi faccio la domanda, un po' come i monaci jainisti, sono pazzo, no? Ecco, ma forse serve la pazzia per una mistica più profonda? Ecco, questa è la domanda. Ecco là, un terzo signore.
Grazie. Volevo chiederle se c'è uno spazio di sacralità per lei a cui accedere. Questo spazio è nella premessa o nella promessa? Sta prima o dopo? L'adesso.
Okay.
Well, 3 very difficult questions. Where are we now and where are we going? Well, I think the most important thing for us all to do is to face up to what is happening, to no longer deny what is happening. And one of the marvelous things about human beings is our capacity to recover from setbacks and to create hopes of a golden future. But there is a distaff side to this, and that is we can be deluded about the future. We are very effective at, with strategies to deny the recognition of what is actually happening. We are very good at engaging in wishful thinking, which is a way of avoiding the full truth of our situation. And there are many very famous historical circumstances in which wishful thinking, the hope that a threat does not exist, has led to catastrophe. And there are also many literary works, I'm thinking, that focus on this theme. I'm thinking of the famous novel by Albert Camus called The Plague. I'm not sure what the Italian translation is of The Plague. But there, the plague came to the town of Oran, and people would refuse to face up to what was happening until, many of them, it was too late. So I think now the Earth in its history and humanity is going into a period of chaos where some people are starting to tell us, notably the scientists, that the situation is changing dramatically, and the order which we have been accustomed to is breaking down. And when that happens, historically, you go into a period of chaos where the systems and the structures, intellectual and otherwise, break down. And what will emerge from that is very hard to predict. Did I feel as though I'd gone crazy? Yes, I did, at times as a result of this earthquake. And some people do. Some people have these events and they do go crazy. It's a very, very powerful thing to happen. And it's why people then go on a quest, on a search, to try to find a context, a framework in which to understand what has happened to them. But, there is a long history of the holy fool, which is something much better recognised in the Eastern traditions than in ours, although, all of the great Christian mystics were regarded by some as being madmen or mad women in some cases. And what about this other question on the sacred in my life, and is it a premise or a promise? I really don't know how to answer that question. The only practice, I suppose, that I engage in is daily meditation, which when I, after the earthquake, it was something that I pursued meditation very sort of vigorously. And in those days, how long ago was it? 23 years. For the first years, the meditation practice was a very important way of me to regain equilibrium and to understand or to gain access to or have insights into that other world from which this event came. But nowadays, I merely engage in meditation as a kind of management of daily life stresses practice. So I think that's about all I can say.
Ho una domanda anch'io, poi ne raccogliamo ancora dal pubblico se c'è qualcuno. Io penso che con queste riflessioni e con queste trasformazioni di cui hai preso coscienza, cambia la nozione di mistico e di mistica. Puoi eventualmente fare un punto meglio su questo rispetto anche alla prospettiva che hai nell'Economista Mistico? Ho avuto la percezione che sia cambiato un po' con queste nuove riflessioni che ci hai dato la tua visione dell'esperienza mistica o della natura del mistico, in connessione con tutte queste trasformazioni, prima fra tutte la secolarizzazione e la globalizzazione come dati concreti d'esperienza, non negabili, non cancellabili, no? Non violabili. Questa è la mia domanda. Se c'è qualcuno? Laggiù.
Io vorrei chiedere se pensa, alla luce delle sue esperienze, dei suoi studi e del suo sentire, che il libero arbitrio esista o che noi siamo solo un piccolo ingranaggio in un sistema infinito e come tale ci muoviamo in maniera, anche quando è consapevole, in realtà dettata da delle leggi di causa e effetto. Grazie.
La mia domanda si integra a questa. Non sappiamo, non possiamo prevedere il futuro, lei ha detto. Tuttavia, in questo antropocene, l'uomo è oggetto o soggetto? E se è oggetto, oggetto di chi o che cosa? E se è soggetto, quali sono le responsabilità e le possibilità?
Ascoltandola, io ho continuato a pensare a un personaggio, Rudolf Steiner, quando lei ha parlato di libertà, libero arbitrio, quando ha parlato del mondo degli uomini che sono diventati adulti. Io ho continuato a pensare a questo ponte e le volevo chiedere se nella sua ricerca ha incrociato questo come dire, questo filosofo, questo antroposofo. Grazie.
C'è ancora, ce n'è ancora due? Le facciamo?
Dopo, adesso sono 4, così non diventa troppo...
Okay. Wow. Okay, let me try to take each briefly. The first question to do with participation mystique, and I think this was participation mystique, which is the anthropologists have discovered was very much a way of defining the way archaic peoples, native peoples, not related to the world but existed in the world, was something that was closely aligned, in fact, the obverse side of the so-called enchantment of the world. It was Max Weber who popularized the phrase the disenchantment of the world, but in fact the phrase was originally due to Hölderlin, the German romantic poet. And the essence of what I'm saying is that although for many years I had this sense that really here was this world of enormous power in which we could participate, in which we could be engaged and absorbed, and if we learn, as in the Eastern traditions, to have access to that mystical world, then this would enable us to live more fulfilled and truthful and authentic lives in the everyday world. But as I said in my talk, I've been shifting away from that view. I talked a lot about Bonhoeffer, but in fact, I've been quite heavily influenced by the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, who takes a similar kind of view. So this does raise the question of which was the second one in this block of questions about free will and whether we can choose our own futures or whether we're merely a cog in the wheel of destiny. I think human beings certainly did have, in fact I think we were granted free will. That is the nature of the modern world. The hard thing for each of us is to live up to our free will. And I think we have to confess that in the kinds of societies we have created, heavily consumer-oriented, heavily conventional, most people are quite happy to relinquish their free will and to become kind of ciphers in the marketplace, and to give over their intellect to televisions. But historical circumstances then sometimes arise where human beings decide to assert their free will and attempt to take things into their own hands. And I think that's certainly what we need to do now, because, as I said earlier, here we're faced with this enormous crisis of global warming and climate change, where already we have set the Earth onto a different path. We can no longer go back to the way it was. It's too late for that. The question is whether we can moderate the damage that will be done to the Earth and protect as much as we reasonably can, and then manage it for the future. And for that we need to rediscover our free will, to become open to the facts and to act on them. But at the moment, humanity is denying what is happening because it's too uncomfortable to face up to the truth. And this leads naturally to the next question on subjectivity and objectivity. So to the extent that I just explained, yes, we are subjects. But I also now take the view, and this is something that I've only shifted to, again, I confess, under the influence of Heidegger, to a sense that there is a larger destiny going on behind the scenes, that perhaps the gods withdrew from the world at the time of the Enlightenment to provide humanity with the opportunity to find its own way, to assert its free will, its power, its responsibility. But that does not mean that there is no grander destiny lying behind that, nor does it mean that the gods, whatever that might mean, may not choose to return to the Earth. And just finally on Rudolf Steiner, I briefly read some of his works several years ago, and he became he was very well regarded as a kind of mystic philosopher in his early years, anthroposophy, but many people think that he went a little bit crazy later on, as many of us do. So I'm not very familiar with Rudolf Steiner, I have to say.
Ci sono altre domande? Quindi, ok, raccogliamo. Direi. No, vedo che andiamo andando con un ritmo abbastanza ok, quindi c'è tempo, spazio per varie domande, non c'è problema. C'è signora qui? Patrizia? Anche qui? Ecco, sì, segui tu bene. Così.
Buongiorno a tutti. Senta, lei ha individuato come momento di stacco nello sviluppo economico l'illuminismo, come momento in cui ci si allontana un po' da un'etica religiosa in senso ampio a un'etica più umana, spinta allo sviluppo non etico dell'economia. Ma dove lei vede uno sviluppo etico dell'economia prima dell'illuminismo?
Io ho una domanda poco filosofica, però, nel senso che volevo sapere cosa consiglia un imprenditore in questo momento difficile di crisi economica, di probabili disordini sociali che soprattutto in Europa che ci saranno, di grande difficoltà, cosa consiglia di fare, come consiglia di comportarsi per non tradire la propria natura, diciamo, spirituale?
si sente. Allora, io mi sono chiesta molto questa mattina come questa sua idea della trasformazione possa toccare il mondo dell'economia reale, della finanza, della politica, e in un certo qual modo come in quest'epoca in cui gli dei si sono ritirati dal mondo, la filosofia possa legarsi con la vita reale, questo nostro mondo, così alla deriva. La ringrazio.
Ancora una?
No, io mi collego solo a quello che ha appena detto la signora, integrando un po' la domanda e chiedendo quanto questa trasformazione della visione anche economicistica della realtà è individuale e quanto è generalizzabile, nel senso quanto il percorso spirituale deve essere individuale delle persone, intimo, e quanto invece può avere risvolti sul quotidiano della vita lavorativa, della vita reale, della vita economica anche delle nazioni e degli stati.
I wish we had audiences like this in Australia. Although it puts me on the spot. Maybe. Okay. Human-based ethics, I think this is truly one of the biggest questions, because there's a kind of ethical vacuum in which the modern world exists. The basis for humanistic ethics is very shaky and very thin, and I suspect that today in the 21st century we are still living on the legacy of Christian ethics, even though Christianity as a political and social force in most countries has mostly declined, seriously declined. In another book I've written subsequently, I noticed that someone out there had bought it, called The Freedom Paradox. I attempt to grapple with this question and went to the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, very interesting German philosopher of the 19th century, who attempted, I think quite brilliantly, but may or may not be successfully, to locate or to ground a new ethics in this fundamental distinction between the world of appearances and the deeper world of noumenal phenomena, the kind of world that I talked about, that we have access to occasionally, fleeting glimpses or sensations. And then when you do have a sense of that deeper world, the one fundamental thing is, and this is the foundation of Eastern philosophical traditions, there's this profound notion of oneness, which gives rise to a sense of compassion, of shared fate, of shared destiny, and that could be the foundation for a new ethical code. And perhaps that's what we need more than anything else in this time of social unrest and economic crisis, because we have constructed and live in an economic system which is matched by a political system where there are very powerful forces operating on us every day to think only of our own interests, of our self-interests, and perhaps those of our immediate family and those around us. And I mean, after all, every time you turn on a television set, you are bombarded with messages about what it means to live a happy life. And nowadays, the market has redefined happiness so that happiness is achieved through our consumption activity and the kinds of brands that we identify with. I mean, one of the great ironies of our existing system is that it can continue to evolve only by making us unhappy or believe that we are unhappy. Because unless the advertisers can constantly persuade us that we're missing something, that there's some inadequacy in our lives, only to the extent that they can persuade us to yearn for something, to constantly rekindle our desire for things. In other words, only if the advertisers can constantly make us feel dissatisfied can the system be sustained and grow. And the most radical thing an individual can do in today's world is to refuse to buy into that. It sounds like an easy thing to do, but in fact it's an extremely difficult thing to do. Pressure is enormous, and we're all subject to it. I'm not saying we should go and live in caves and dress in rags, but we should, I think, learn to consume, to exist in a conscious, self-reflective, self-critical way. And above all, we should teach our children how to live that way so that they can exercise their free will. And so how will that affect the evolution, the development of the real world, and can philosophy act as a bridge in everyday life? Well, unfortunately, certainly, as you probably know, there's a great division within philosophy nowadays between what's known as analytical philosophy, which dominates the Anglosphere in the United States and the UK, and continental philosophy. And it's clear where my sympathies lie, because analytical philosophy is really, a kind of version or an apologetics for economics and the individualism of modern day life. So nevertheless, philosophy as a discipline has receded in public consciousness and its influence in recent decades. Perhaps it was only since the heyday of existentialism in the 50s and 60s that philosophy could be said to have had a defining influence on society. I think postmodernism was in the 70s and 80s was really reflecting changes in society rather than leading them. So perhaps what I've said there gives a few clues to respond to that last question about the spiritual development of the individual, because it must be said that to talk about spiritual matters and certainly to talk about personal experiences which of a spiritual nature is a kind of embarrassing thing to do in the modern day world, because it opens you up to ridicule. And in fact, let me just finish with a little story. When I was in the sort of grip of this sort of holy madness a year or two after that earthquake, I was invited onto the radio in Australia on the ABC, the public broadcaster, on a program where people talked about these things. And I did speak at some length about that experience and how it had left me and the kind of psychological dramas that it gives rise to. And I found perhaps, and there was a very good sort of response from certain people to me being open about that. But about 10 years later, after I had established this think tank, the Australia Institute, which was kind of my big break with conventional life to go off and do something dramatic that could fail, but set up this think tank, which, as it happened, was quite successful. And I became a kind of influential, moderately influential figure in some debates in Australia, particularly on climate change. I was alerted one day by someone who rang me from the Senate, Australia's parliamentary upper house, to say I should turn on the radio and listen to the broadcast of proceedings in the Senate. And there was one of the more right-wing members of the Conservative Party in the Senate who had launched this vicious personal attack on me and was drawing on these revelations I had made in that ABC program 10 years earlier, making me out to be this sort of madman who has these sort of crazy visions and, is sort of deluded. And so, I learned it was very painful to be misrepresented and attacked in those terms. And I did learn a big lesson about be very careful what you say, because people will misinterpret it, and if they're malevolent, as this senator was, use it against you.
Che diceva prima dell'illuminismo l'economia, mi pare Caterina avesse fatto questa domanda, com'era prima, ecco, che aveva fatto la bella signora Mora.
Uno sviluppo etico dell'economia.
Ecco, com'era, lui dice prima dell'economia, prima dell'illuminismo,
sì.
prima dell'economia.
Qualche altra domanda raccogliamo oltre a questa? Anche quella dell'imprenditore.
No, mi chiedevo, in questa epoca di grande trasformazione, come ritiene che la scuola, il mondo dell'educazione, sia la scuola, quindi l'educazione formale, sia l'educazione informale, quella dell'associazionismo, possa, se ritiene, contribuire in qualche modo a rimettere in asse, diciamo così, perché io penso che l'educazione sia un motore molto forte, però vedo che è un motore imballato, cioè non riesce a muoversi. Ecco. Grazie.
Le domande saranno due. Una è questa, proprio facendo seguito. Signore, nell'educazione il modo di concepire la realtà. 30 anni fa, quando abbiamo incominciato a interessarci di educazione ambientale, il rapporto uomo-ambiente, ci siamo trovati in questo massimo antropocentrismo. La maggior parte degli studenti, negli testi che noi sottoponevamo, diceva l'uomo è il centro e via, no? Quindi abbiamo cercato, almeno con alcuni insegnanti, di ribaltare il concetto del rapporto uomo-ambiente da quello antropocentrico ad uno almeno più biocentrico, cioè dove la vita, quindi la natura, perché è chiaro il momento in cui si è diviso il soggetto e l'oggetto. L'uomo ha lasciato completamente il fatto che fa parte di questa natura, che è fatto di terra, da cui l'umiltà di cui lei ha parlato, per cui una cultura occidentale aveva nel Medioevo ancora un rispetto per la natura, non dico la sacralità vera e propria, perché poi c'era Dio di mezzo, però c'era questa visione. Ecco, mi chiedo, non sapevo di Bonhoeffer, ho letto Bonhoeffer alcune cose, ma il Cristo di Bonhoeffer, cioè quel cristianesimo che rimandava a un Cristo interessato anche al sociale, no? Al punto di, per amore, andare a finire sulla croce, era ancora quello che rimandava al Dio di Gesù Cristo o a un Dio che poteva essere quello dei pagani, cioè bisogna anche vedere quale immagine si ha di Dio, perché nel Medioevo tutta questa vicenda dell'universo, che è enorme, no? È riconosciuta, creata, cioè da un'entità trascendente, non si può dire come una trascendenza. E io faccio questa domanda, ma secondo lei la natura, la trascendenza potrebbe essere oggi anche la natura stessa, per cui si potrebbe arrivare da un punto di vista etico a una posizione di umiltà e di riconoscimento di essere parte e quindi non essere padroni del mondo? Grazie.
Direi di fermarci, no? Perché...
Okay, well again, thank you very much for those questions. Before the Enlightenment, there was no economics. There was no separation of the activities that people engaged in to provide for their material needs and their relationship to society and nature. It was only after the Enlightenment that economics as we understand it could emerge. Of course, there was exchange and trade beforehand, but that was conducted very much on a kind of mercantile or mercantilist kind of understanding. So I don't think, there's certainly no going back to the kind of world and the kind of economy, to the extent there was an economy before the Enlightenment. On the education question, as I intimated earlier, I think one of the most important things that we can do and should do in our education system is to resist the temptation to see the education system as kind of an institution for the market, to resist training children to be just effective workers with skills. I think we need to teach them to understand the world much more deeply, including the kinds of pressures on them that turn them into little consumers. And there was a very deliberate decision made in the late 1990s by advertisers in the United States, but then spreading to Europe and elsewhere, to target children very specifically as a new demographic. It was like the old Jesuit saying, give me a child until he's 7 and I'll give you the man. Well, it's now the advertisers who are capturing childhood to the age of 7, and they're creating the consumers who will drive it. I mean, it may be hard to see this in Italy today, but there will be another great consumer boom, and it will be the children whose attitudes about consumption in the market were forged in the 10 or 20 years before the crisis of 2008. It will be they who drive the next consumer boom. The other thing I'd just say about schools is that I think it's never too early to teach philosophy to children. And there are some schools around the world, scattered around the world, who have, even in primary school, 7, 8-year-old children have started to discuss philosophical questions. And children can talk about these things. Well, that's fantastic. Very, very important, because it gives perspective. It allows children to learn to be self-critical and to engage properly in discussion. And one of the philosophical questions that could and should be dealt with in schools is precisely this question of anthropocentrism, because it invites people to reflect on what it is to be a human being and what our place is in the universe. And this is very much a contested question, as we know. And there's no doubt that we have forgotten our origins. I mean, there's a trivial sense in which this is true. Well, it's not trivial, it's actually very important, in which children who grow up in urban areas, for the most part, don't have any good understanding of where their sustenance comes from. So I think that those profound questions about the place of humanity in the universe can be dealt with in schools to get children thinking about them from a very early age. So finally, on the question of transcendence today, let me put it in terms of the theme that runs through a book that I've finished, which will be published in February next year. It's a book about climate engineering or geoengineering, a very, very important topic that you probably don't know about yet, but in 10 years' time, everybody will know about it, believe me. But in this book, I draw a distinction between two huge trends within humanity. One I characterize as Promethean, after the Greek god Prometheus, as you know, who brought technological power to humanity. And it's Prometheus who has dominated the world. He's dominating the world now. And it's why, in response to climate change, there's a substantial number of scientists and venture capitalists who are now developing grand technological interventions in the climate system, which are aimed at essentially taking control of the climate system of the Earth as a whole and regulating it in our interests in perpetuity. Now, I find this one of the most terrifying things that I've ever heard about, but there are people genuinely doing it. And given the failure of the world to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the likelihood that we will face severe climatic crises in 15, 20, certainly 30 years' time, there is every possibility that these grand technological interventions will go ahead. Against the Prometheans who are making this kind of argument for total technological control are people I would describe, or I have described with a new term, a neologism, who I call Satyrians, after the Greek goddess, because I asked myself, well, if Prometheus is the Greek god of technological power and control, who is, well, he was a Titan, who is the Greek god or goddess of caution, of humility, of deliverance, of safety? And when I looked at the pantheon of Greek gods, the most appropriate one was the goddess Satyria. And we can see in the world the Satyrians, perhaps many of us in this room would classify ourselves as Satyrians, who are afraid of the exertion of power, the continued exertion of power of Prometheans, who, after all, dominate the world, and who will attempt to get us, humanity, to take a more humble, self-effacing path in the future.
Abbiamo raggiunto l'orario finale, poi riprendiamo il dialogo. Facciamo ancora qualche domanda? Una, due, tre, le ultime tre, dai, ok.
Dov'era il signore che ha alzato la mano? Lei? Ah, sì.
Buongiorno, grazie del suo contributo. Dunque, volevo dire una cosa, volevo fare una premessa sul discorso che ha fatto proprio adesso dei prometeici. Cioè, penso che rispetto a questa realtà sia importante sviluppare molta coscienza e dedicare molte energie a questo genere di convegni, ma anche a attività investigative, processi e attività per fermare questo genere di intervento e di progetto proprio di visione sul mondo che da parte sostanzialmente delle multinazionali e quindi del capitale globale esiste. Questo mi sembra fondamentale, prendere atto che esiste una lotta in corso terribile. Comunque non era su questo che volevo intervenire. Io volevo dire questa cosa. Mi sembra che dagli interventi sia emerso da un lato questa antropocene, cioè la centralità dell'uomo nel pianeta, addirittura si è detto l'uomo che si considera padrone della terra. Dall'altro lato, leggendo il manifesto per i beni comuni di Ugo Mattei, lui parla del superamento della separazione che esiste fra osservatore e contesto osservato, cosa propria dell'illuminismo che poi si traduce in tutte le discipline scientifiche, non solo nell'economia. Quindi mi sembra che da un lato la realtà dell'azione presenta una situazione in cui l'uomo è al centro, è il padrone della situazione, dall'altro nell'analisi l'osservatore si tira fuori dal contesto osservato e quindi di fatto la domanda di Nietzsche, uomo dove sei, è attualissima. Com'è possibile che da un lato sia il padrone e dall'altro non ci sia? Grazie.
Volevo chiedere se nella prospettiva del superamento di questo stallo noi occidentali non possiamo anche porci in ascolto di quello che hanno da dire le culture tradizionali, non nel senso dell'incanto del mondo, ma nel senso di pratiche che si pongono in una situazione di fraternità rispetto alla natura. Penso soprattutto ai movimenti indigeni dell'America Latina, dove ci sono esempi proprio di pratiche in cui l'uomo si pone non come soggetto o come oggetto, ma forse come co-soggetto di una trasformazione. Grazie.
Ancora una, arrivo.
Grazie. Lei ha parlato del discorso causa-effetto. Volevo chiederle, dato che oggi c'è anche una nuova scienza, voglio dire in termini quantistici, eccetera, tra i vari postulati c'è anche che l'osservatore modifica l'osservato e al tempo stesso ne è modificato. Questo è quello che anche dice Panikkar. E le chiedo, questa potrebbe essere una via per uscire mi è sfuggita la parola perché per me è nuova, lei mi ha illuminato su questo, l'ampotrocentrismo. Ecco, grazie.
Sì. Yeah. Okay, thanks once again. Just I'd very much like to respond to the first point made. I think it's that that we do have an obligation to be political actors, as well as thinking about what we're doing as individuals, that in the end, particularly in our kinds of societies, change comes around as a result of being politically engaged and challenging the institutions of power in the way that you suggested. And I am fundamentally a political activist. I sometimes think of my writings as what I call advocacy scholarship. It's not dispassionate for the sake of knowledge alone, it's for the sake of changing the world, always. So on this question of the Anthropocene, and we have kind of two related questions here about the relationship between the observer and the observed. I think there's probably kind of three distinct ways of understanding this. One is the notion of the pre-Enlightenment notion of human beings who understood themselves in terms of their direct participation in the world. And it was, as I said, it was in Renaissance Italy in particular that the idea of the distinct individual with the, really for the first time emerged. I mean, we think that's just how the world is, that's just what human beings are, and we forget that in fact this is this kind of thinking of ourselves as distinct subjective individuals is actually a very modern idea and a very Western idea. And so the split of the subject from object, which was emerged in society, reflected in those fabulous paintings in Bergamo, for instance, became formalized and represented in classical science, Newtonian science in particular, and this rigid separation between the objective, independent world and the scientific observer looking upon it as a distinct sort of subject. But I think this idea of the observer modifying the world, as in quantum physics, is really a third kind of thing which hasn't, I don't think it has anything to do with the pre-Enlightenment notion of participation. But I would only say this, that if we're talking about transcendence, which is really certainly in the mystical tradition, both the mystical tradition of the West and the mystical tradition of the East, Transcendence as the idea of the merging of subject and object, the collapse of the two into one, if only briefly, is, I'm starting to suspect, and this is just a very new idea and it could be completely wrong, that in the future we will have some new notion, some new idea, some new experience of transcendence, not one that we can get from Saint Teresa or from, the Buddha, but some, I don't know what it is, but some new notion of transcendence that goes beyond and grows out of the world come of age. And I think that too also answers this question I was asked about the insights of Indigenous people. And of course in Australia, among environmentalists such as myself, there's been a great interest and great respect for the relationship of the Aboriginal people to their lands. I mean, in a way, we're kind of envious. I mean, it seems bizarre to kind of be envious of people many of whose material living standards are so shameful. Nevertheless, Indigenous people in Australia recognise that they have something very, very powerful, and that is their relationship to what they call country, which is country is kind of a much richer notion than land. It does kind of reflect this sort of integration of the person with their country. And so, when Aboriginal people meet each other, they always ask, well, which mob are you from? Which means kind of which tribe, which always means, which patch of country is yours. And that's how they define themselves at their deepest level, their country, what they belong to and what they then have responsibility for. And of course, one can only have tremendous sort of respect and this funny kind of envy for that sort of relationship. But I don't think it's the answer to the future. I think the world has been so radically transformed, including, of course, the traditional lands of Aboriginal people and Indigenous people around the world, so that whilst we should do all we can to try and protect and preserve and respect that relationship, I don't think that we can find in that relationship the answers to the future that we need to find in the Anthropocene, a world that in its total systemic character has now been set on a different path, not changed in a way that can now be changed back. It's too late to change it back. We've transformed it so much. We've set in train these very powerful forces that will last thousands of years. So we have to think of or wait for new ways of understanding, new philosophies, new forms of transcendence, and perhaps new gods to come and show us the way forward.
Grazie mille. Adesso ci fermiamo, nel pomeriggio riprenderemo con la riflessione e ci auguriamo che il dialogo nelle seguenti occasioni che avremo da oggi fino a domenica possa integrare, connettere bene tutto quello che già questa mattina è emerso. Grazie Clive.
Ecco,
grazie a voi, ci vediamo nel pomeriggio.
Grazie a tutti, grazie Clive. Vi chiedo, oggi riprendiamo alle 3, se gentilmente arrivate una decina di minuti prima, in modo alle 3 di iniziare, essere puntuali con i nostri ospiti. Grazie, buon appetito!